Hello, everybody. My name is Finnian, and I am going to be recording a little bit of a Medium tutorial slash design demo. I've done a couple sessions in the past where I've recorded and streamed a little bit of Medium, but usually not with audio, so I thought this time I'd give it a shot because some people have been asking for some design within Medium and seeing how the application works towards a production pipeline. So today I've done a little bit of painting beforehand. I have 4 thumbnails as inspiration and a couple call-out designs. My end goal is to create hopefully 4 or 5 different assets that I'll then use to make a few scenes with. I'll be rendering the final scenes in Octane and Cinema 4D. And I've made a spaceship design that will already be the focus of these scenes. This is basically to show the organic background for a couple different frames. Now the final thumbnails on the left don't really simulate the end goal. It's more like inspiration for some of the objects I'll be creating during the session. So when I get into 3D, I'll probably be changing the camera angle and doing a bunch of different shots. But anyways, let's start. I think the first one I'll tackle is the one on the right, because that's the one that I feel like I'm drawn to the most in terms of the design. So when I'm within Medium, I usually like to start things out with mirror turned on. And then if I need to add asymmetrical details in the future, I can definitely do that. But let's start with just with blocking out the forms. So there's a lot of different ways you can do this. You could do a wireframe, and that's what I generally like when I'm still figuring something out, because it's still a 2D call out. It doesn't really give you the total dimensions. You can kind of get a little bit of a feeling for the object depending on the rendering and style of it. But I like to also do a little bit of sketch sometimes just to figure out exactly how tall something is, what the full dimensions of it will be, if there's going to be any other ground or terrain besides it. This phase I'm usually really sketchy. I'm basically just trying to mimic some of the proportions and just really block out the design. And I'm kind of imagining that it's pretty wide at the top, like a piece of coral, and then maybe even tapers a little bit towards the end. So almost like the end of a piece of toothpaste almost has a little bit of a tapered edge to it. So when I'm sculpting these, I just want to block out the main forms, and I think that's probably good enough. This is where I would start my sketch, or stop the main block out, and then I'll do another layer and start to kind of build in the forms themselves. Now, one thing you could do is you could actually start using the color of whatever object it is. I don't necessarily always do this, but it is fun to sometimes differentiate things, because then with your sketch you can have something a little bit different. I'll be using sometimes some custom brushes that I've made, but things like this, it's very simple to make. I'll probably make some brushes during this demo at some point, so we'll definitely go over that. Right now, I kind of just want to simulate a little bit of what the ground plane can be, and we're staying fairly low resolution with our geometry, then kind of building up the main stalk or shape here. Imagining this comes in different sections, so kind of like a tubule. And when I'm thinking about all this stuff, like the reasons I've chosen the proportions that I have is because of contrast. I wanted to create something that is interesting to look at, but not too interesting that it'll become the focus of a piece. So the goal with these objects wasn't to create some crazy, complex piece of geometry that in the end will dominate the visuals of the scene. It's more to create something that will be pleasing to look at and cause a little curiosity to occur. Maybe the viewers, when they look at this, will be interested about the world that they came from. But I still, when you're designing for, say, a keyframe shot, you always want to make sure that the background objects in your scene don't compete with the main visual. And reasons that could happen could be because of too much detail, too many different shape languages going on. For this, for instance, the shape language is a lot of round objects and corally shapes, and then a secondary shape language is the long spindly forms going off on top of it. But say if you have too many different shape languages going on, and if they're too different from what the rest of your scene is, then in the end it can actually be detrimental, and it will. I'm just going to rotate the light a little bit so I have a better view of this. It could be detrimental, and you want to instead be a designer and really focus on what the necessary forms are in your design. So now we've got a pretty straightforward blackout. I'm contemplating, I think I'm going to switch to, it's going to switch mirror off now because there's some really interesting parts of this design that I want to block in. And I'm going to start using the move tool. I've been using the clay tool for the past few minutes now, but the move tool is really useful to start playing with proportions. And one thing that you might want to do, it doesn't really apply to us so much, but make sure that when you start this, you turn on active layer only. If you have a very complex sculpt, this can mess you up because it can start dragging out pieces of your sculpt that you otherwise wouldn't really want to be messing with. A lot of the forms in this I'm already liking, like the little pieces of geometry here. It's already kind of getting a corally feeling, which is nice. This taper could use a little bit of tucking in there. And then the most important part of this piece to me, this individual object, is the eye right there at the top. And one thing to be conscious of when you're designing callouts is that you want to treat the design as if it's its own composition. Because it is. It's basically like a composition of shapes in the same way that keyframe or environment design would be. You want to boil down your entire piece into individual micro compositions. And thinking about it this way is a great way to do that because you can then take into account all the forms and kind of assign a focal point to your design, which becomes fun in the end. Now, overall, I'm kind of happy with this as a base for the proportions. It's a little bit different, but it's okay because I like the changes that we've made. I'm going to add a little bit more, but soon I'm actually going to start separating this off into different layers because I want to make sure that in our material phase, when we start going into Octane, which I'm not sure if I'll record. Hopefully at a later date I'll have time to actually record a full session in Octane. But when I go to material, start using displacement and other things, I want to make sure that the materials are all separated, the layers are separated already. So make sure that when you're doing this stuff, you think about the different the different selections of layers and how you're going to be figuring that out in 3D. Yeah. So right now, you know what, I think I might just drag it all up a little bit. And this is a fun way to stretch your proportions. Small change, but I think it's necessary. And this base, maybe just curve it a little bit more. There we go. So now I'm going to switch and add a new layer. And this layer, we can actually make a different color. We'll do more saturated with this because it'll start the secondary details. And this is where I'm going to start layering the patterns because I really like some of the patterns that we have going on. Just starting with the ground pieces here, I want to make sure we have that little bit of a raise in the ground plane. I think if I was in the studio, I would want to make sure that all the stuff is very thought out and that I was sticking to the original design. If that was an approved sketch. But because this is for personal work, I am having more liberty with the design and having a little bit more fun with the shapes. It's okay to break a couple of rules here. I'm actually not going to start doing the strands yet because I think I want to have that on a different layer. But you see that there's some little yellow wavery kind of forms here. And actually, I think what I might do is make that into a brush because I think we'll be using it a lot. And this is where using medium is really handy. So if I have something, I'm just going to simulate the rotation a little bit and then, maybe play it with it a bit. This is low-res geometry, which is good for a brush. But I don't want it to be a perfect, don't want it to be a perfect piece of geometry. I want it to have little dents in it here and there, just to simulate the natural feeling of it, because nothing in nature is, so perfect like that. So now I'm going to select this, and I'm going to go into Stamp, and that is going to create our own little piece here. I am going to move it around a little bit so that I have the right dimension. Now we can get rid of this little piece. And now you'll see it's much easier to start adding this on as a texture. You know, it might even be a little bit more excessive with it now because I have it, you know, so readily available. Becomes a fun way to texture the image. I don't want to get too blown away with it because we still have a couple other textures we need to represent here. There's the red, so I want to grab that red while I can before I get too carried away, because sometimes I think it's easy to get carried away with something that you love, especially if it's a pattern. At least for me, I don't know about other people. And there's a reason that the sketch works, at least in my opinion. So you don't want to mess too much with the changes in proportion and detail and everything. Let's see. I'm going to go back to the original. I just noticed that there's a bit more of a bump here. And there's a couple pieces of the sketch which I think are more important than the others. Any section where the secondary form language is attached, that's going to be more important because it's kind of like a major part of the piece. If you're thinking about the anatomy of a structure, that's going to be a major muscle that you want to make sure is represented. It's all a part of balance, and if you don't represent it the same way, or if you don't have that balance, if you don't have the flow like you would to a figure or gesture drawing, for example, then it can actually mess you up. But you know, I'm happy to live with some happy accidents that occur along the road. But you still want to be careful and choose your battles. There we go. Cool. Now let's see, what should I add? So now I think I'm gonna start sculpting the eye up here, and the eye is actually the same material as our base, so that's okay. I can actually keep it. And there's an interesting kind of curve to it. So I'm gonna make the main shape here, and then I'm going to drag the top section to get that ovoid sort of look to it. Because I do like the way that the light is hitting that, and this side is a little bit. There we go. Okay, cool. Happy with that. And then I want to make sure that we punch it out a little bit. I'm going to just add little structure surrounding it. Because, we want it to catch that light. And actually what I might do right now is change the light to the way we have our concept lit, or approximately, and that'll just help us to estimate what we need to fix in terms of the design. For instance, I think that there's a nice gradation and geometry happening in the top section that I want to keep. I might smooth some of this now. Yeah, still want to keep that highlight on the top there, and now I'm going to be moving this section outwards. There we go. So now you can see that's way more apparent, which is good. It's exactly what we wanted to do. I'm going to drag some of the bottom material out so that it doesn't get too crazy with all the yellow texture. I mean, I can kind of picture how this will look once we render it, so it's going to be very different from how it looks now. The reason I add colors is actually a little bit more for people watching, because I think it'll look nicer to you guys, so you'll be able to understand kind of how it works a bit more. But I definitely recommend if adding color to separate the material out helps you guys, definitely do it. I was doing a project recently where I had something like 20 different layers between all the characters and different pieces of scenery, couple interior pieces, and actually that's something where color did really help me out, because in the end I had to juggle between all these different shapes, and it can get a bit overwhelming if you're dealing with tons of different directional lines in your composition. You want to be able to make decisions quickly still. You don't want to have to be lagged up on different decisions you're trying to make. There we go. I actually kind of like the dent that's in this piece already, so I'm going to reinforce that. And the reason I have these lines is actually reinforcing some of the main pieces of our composition. We are basically just taking the main form language, that big eye in the center there, and expanding it and kind of keeping your eye centered on there. It's similar to like when you're doing an environment design to add, say you're adding like one big structure that is, you know, a civilization's home base. You want to make sure that the other buildings in the scene relate to it in some way. And that's kind of what we're doing here on a smaller scale. We're showing that this structure, this whole building, has these different curves in for a reason, that they actually belong there. A good friend of mine said a long time ago that once is a mistake, 2 times you can start to believe it, but 3 is actually when you your brain starts to be immersed by the decision. And that means that like if you're going to have a scene that has one object standing out and you're supposed to feel immersed, it might be better to place a few of the same object around the scene, or it could, you know, even refer to decision making. In the end, you want to show a continuity in the image that you're creating, and it doesn't all. If you're just throwing random things about, you're not going to really get there. And it's something that happens on the subconscious level too. It's not always about just how we perceive of it in our head. Sometimes it is just a natural response from your brain that you can actually really control. Sometimes you don't even realize it's happening until you really analyze and look back at it later. Okay, so I'm liking the textural feeling of it so far. There's some really interesting textural patterns there. And you can see I'm mostly using the round brush. You know, for that one texture we did earlier, I wanted to do it, to use that. But for the most part, since this is a pretty simple piece of geometry, I'm not going to need to use it so much. But now for the last section, I do want to start using a brush. You know, we have all these little curly hue shapes that are going up, and just to help us with that, I am going to doodle a few out, and I want to make sure to be gestural with these and get a variation in shape too, from big to small. Because again, as I was talking about those micro compositions, you don't want that to stop just at the call out. You want to think about all your smaller shapes as micro compositions too. So I think that is looking pretty good overall. Maybe I need a little bit more irregularity in these, because I really like how I've kind of messed about with the shape in the reference image. You know, these aren't perfect curly hues, they're a little bit bent. There we go. Okay, so I'll turn this into a stamp just like last time. Instead of trying to erase this with the stamp, I'm actually going to just change it to a square. And by the way, if anybody uses Medium and wants to figure out how you do that shortcut, you just double tap this cog right here, and it switches from add to subtract. It's really, really handy. Okay, let's see. Now I want to select that, and I think, yeah, we're on the right layer. So now I'll make this layer blue, and I'll just have at it. Ooh, a little bit too dark. Hard to see. Okay, so it looks like we need to increase our resolution a little bit. There we go. Yeah, much better. Okay. Okay. Cool. Okay. So this allows me to get some smaller details as well, which is really nice. And then I'm actually going to use the Move tool. Just want to make sure that's not, yeah, it's on active layer only, great. And then I'll start to twirl these around and twist them a little bit, so you give them a little bit more of a shape. One thing when designing shapes, one subtle thing you can do is that you want to think about the ratio of complex to simple forms, and that even comes in not just within the shape, but the negative space surrounding your shapes as well. Because if you have complex angles all over your forms, it's going to be a little bit hard to understand the relationship between them. So instead, it's kind of nice when you have one side that's very simple, like this sweeping side. There aren't many things that stick out, and then the other side you can see is much more complex. That's something kind of nice to do, and it will make the shapes easier to understand as a whole. Okay, so now I'm just going to fill in these little ones here. Okay, that's grand. So, already I think this area is working nicely, but just so that we take away that kind of pasted look, it's very easy. I'll just drag a few up. These guys I'll just drag out a little bit like the sketch. Then yeah, I think I have a couple more on the bottom. Then maybe just some bushes down at the bottom. Actually, I think for these really, really tiny ones, I actually want to do them individually. And the good thing about this is that I know I've been meaning to keep it fairly low geo. So when I do instances of it in Cinema, it's not going to be tough on my computer. I mean, I have a fairly decent computer, but I know that with instancing, it's not going to create a huge draw on it. So that looks pretty good. I'm going to do some final edits just because I want the light to react a certain way. I want there to be a little bit of a harder edge on this so that this becomes a little bit more contrasted. And the reason I add this edge now is that you can see how the light is forming within the gaps. That's just going to draw your eye to this area a little bit more. It's like adding a little bit of oomph to something. I want to make sure that these gestural lines also have that little bit extra added, and continue this line to the top there, and maybe that line continue it into the crown of the object. Whenever you can continue lines in a composition off of your main focal point, it's actually a really nice opportunity. It just kind of reinforces, again, the overall shape language, so try to do that. Okay, I think we're good. I think any of the smaller bits, like the much smaller bits, I can probably just add with deformation and what's called displacement. So I think we're good for this object. So I'm gonna go ahead and save this, and then I'm gonna start the next one, and I'm gonna save this one as let's see, demo 2. All right. So now, since we have both of those saves, oh well, maybe I should export this actually, just so it's ready to go. Yeah. I don't want to make sure that the export doesn't screw with the video, so I might actually not export. I'll export it after the video. Now I'm going to select all the layers that we just did. I'm going to delete them because I've just saved this to a new sculpt, thankfully. And we'll start with the next one. Now, I'm a bit torn because I really like the large tree shape on that one. I think that will be cool to make. Yeah, I think I'm going to go with that for the next design. So again, we can start with mirror on. And this time it's going to be darker. And for this, I think there's a fun trick in Octane that I learned recently with some scatter tools, where you can scatter really basic geometry over a form with a dirt map, and it will scatter, it'll basically populate one larger object with lots of smaller details, and it's going to be pretty perfect for this. So I'm not sure yet how much exactly I'm going to add in terms of the trees. Yeah, I might just play with the overall shape of the structure, whatever this big structure is. And for the top of it, because I didn't really design the top so much in my composition. Maybe the top is some jagged rock form. It's actually not a tree in the base. It's just that the top can be a different material. Okay, so then there can be like a couple different layers of rock in this. Try to think of ways we can separate out the materials, because if you're going to say apply the design principles to a large shape like this when you're starting out your composition, I want 70% of it to be the tree and 30% of it to be the rock. Now, it's not going to be accurately represented exactly, and the reason I say that is because I'm going to be doing a lot of the tree stuff when we get back to cinema. But I'll at least start out with the rock stuff. Now, Medium has an amazing selection of rocks already, so I do like to kind of start with these, although I want to make sure I don't go too crazy high res. See, like, it's already, just the texture that you get with this stuff is so great. It's going to be perfect. If you guys know dirt maps, it's kind of works based off of the I mean, I could be totally getting this wrong. I feel like it works with the ambient occlusion. So all the little nooks and crannies where ambient occlusion would occur, I feel like that's usually where you get the dirt map shader to work. I could totally be wrong with that, because there's probably some 3D pros out there. I'm not crazy. I don't know that much about 3D, but that's how it's kind of seemed to me. So when I sculpt this, I want to keep that in mind, that I want to be careful with those nooks and crannies to make sure that in the final design, that's the area that will be populated. Again, I'll be changing this up for sure once we get back and turn off mirror. But for now, I kind of like, some of these textures that we're getting from having the mirroring turned on is exciting. And for this one, I think for this scene, I'm going to make a second object too after I finish this one. That is a smaller version of it. So now I'll take off the mirror, and I will take off the sketch layer. Now we're just left with the rock. So it's time to start cutting into this. Again, we can't really see too much of the top face in my sketch, so I'm going to be improvising for most of it, which is great too. I actually usually don't have sketches when I'm working in Medium. I do usually have a lot of references, though. If I'm ever starting a sculpt, say in Gravity Sketch or Medium, I always make sure to have tons of reference. I'll usually fill up this whole black space you see around you. It's basically like an infinite desk, which is something that I really, really enjoy about the program, is that you can have as many objects in the scene as you want, as many different pieces and documents and photos that you've taken. That stuff is always really, really useful to me. I think when I was painting these, I had a lot of references up, so that's why I don't exactly have them up right now. But I think if anybody out there is struggling to get interesting designs, or you're not feeling inspired, I think consuming a big amount of reference daily is always super helpful. Personally, I always go on Pinterest for a large portion of the day, go searching for new things, adding new things to my collection, and man, I've been doing that for years now. So whenever I feel like I need to find a cool image, or if I'm feeling uninspired, I have tons of organized folders with a bunch of different imagery in it that I can always draw upon. So now again, I'm using that move tool to just play a little bit with the proportions. It was looking a little bit too puffed out. Let's see, there we go. So I just wanted to change the proportions a little bit before we go on. This hat of sorts up here isn't really working in terms of the texture. I think we could probably increase the resolution now. So I want to make sure I get into this and cut into it a little bit. You can also be gestural about how you cut up forms. There's times where I want to be very specific and be like, oh, let me make sure I get this face exactly right. But I think there is an artistry to getting a gesture within a VR model. Of course, with any 3D model, but I think the fact that you can, be so quick with your movements to really defined shapes that way is very fun and unique to VR. So I think if you guys out there want to start getting your gestural strokes in, it's a fun thing to do. I take a little chunk out of that forward piece. You know, basically any piece that I think looks too mirrored right now, I'm going to be taking pieces out of. But overall, I think it's okay. And I think because I'll have a lot of these in the scene, I'm definitely going to spend more time designing the back side of this object. For the other one, I was the scene I pictured in my head. We're not going to need to see the other side of it too much. But for this one, I think we will. So here we go. Okay, cool. So honestly, this is kind of for what I want to do in that image. This is getting to the point where I need. The only thing that I really want to start enforcing now is it might not be able to see it in VR, but if you're on the ArtStation page, it'll probably have it. There's these little striations I have in it that I do enjoy a lot, and I'm going to be very careful about how I place those. And you can notice that I'm not going crazy with how deep the cuts go, and I'm definitely trying to space it out too. I'm trying to space out the texture. There's definitely a reason for that. I'm thinking that it's a sort of weathering pattern, and with weathering, there's a lot of different types, but I want to make it seem like this is something that has occurred over the years. So it's not something where someone just came up to this thing with a giant claw and slashed it, you know. But instead, it needs to be something that's more delicately done. And for times like this, when you're doing something that really requires you to think about how the lines are flowing, that's something where I wouldn't exactly make a stamp for, because I think the effect that I'm trying to achieve right now is a little bit too precise to use a stamp. Yeah, so that's already I'm kind of liking how that looks, and you'll notice that I started with one much larger stroke, and then the lines are very deliberate. I'm never making a line without a reason for it. I'm always thinking about the spacing between them, even when it comes to things like this, and thinking about how this would have formed over time. Yeah, I think even adding a little bit of strokes to accentuate that larger one could be cool. And I think I might also play with this later with the move tool, but I want this to basically gradiate out from that larger stroke, as if this was the deepest weathering spot, and then as it fades away from the main structure, it gets lighter and lighter. Yeah, I think we're almost there. There we go. Maybe one last line. Okay, so that is this main rock structure for me. I will populate it with trees and plants in medium. Well, there maybe are a couple things I want to do. I said medium, I meant cinema. I think it would be fun to get. There's a couple little offshoots that I have there. I think that would be fun to do. So. And these, you know, I imagine they're a type of plant that are growing out of the side of this thing. And once we have the bushes in, this will be a pretty fun thing to have growing out of the sides. It's going to add a lot of focus to the areas that we put them in, because it'll be so different from all the other forms. So I do want to be specific and careful about where I add them. So it's not like I'm going to go crazy and add them everywhere. But as you can see in the painting that I did, the thumbnail, they exist in a couple different spots. The good thing is if I ever want to change this later on in terms of the placement, it's very easy to, because now I have these all in separate layers. So I can just select a group of these polygons and change them pretty quickly. And again, I want one side to be more complex. And maybe even they can follow their own pattern of a curving line that comes up. And we can just hint at it. We don't need to be very, very specific, but it'd be nice to kind of mimic some sort of natural path with them. You know. Yeah, I think that's kind of enough for this one. All right. So I know this has been a pretty short video, but I think this explains a little bit of the process. Let me know if there's any questions. I'll be happy to comment and answer anything. And if you guys like this, I'll do more in the future. Thanks.